Hello and welcome to our webinar. This is Carol Rosenfeld. I'm a Senior Project Director here at the Environmental Finance Center at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And we're so glad to have you joining us today for our webinar on the results of the 2017-2018 North Carolina Water and Wastewater Utility Management Survey. So briefly, the Environmental Finance Center here at UNC School of Government is dedicated to helping organizations, government and otherwise, to find ways to fairly and effectively provide environmental services, and also in financially sustainable ways. We do this through applied research, teaching and outreach, and program design and evaluation. And this project that has the survey that we're talking about today and the results and analysis was funded by the North Carolina Policy Collaboratory. And we have also partnered with the North Carolina League of Municipalities on putting all of this together. So I'd like to turn it over to Chris Nida, the Director of Research and Strategic Initiatives at the League, to tell us a little bit about the work that they do.
Thank you very much, Carol, and thank you all for joining us today. I appreciate you taking the time to be with us to talk about the results of this survey. I will leave it to Carol to talk about to some of the numbers and some of the results that we have seen overall. I just wanted to take a brief minute and thank all of you. I know that we had 227 respondents to the survey. 168 of those were municipalities. I know it was an extensive survey about some important information. And I really just want to thank all of you for taking the time to participate and spend your time providing us with this valuable information. I also want to thank everybody at the Environmental Finance Center for their partnership on these important issues. We partnered with the EFC. Labor Day will be my 10-year anniversary with the League of Municipalities. We've been partnering with the EFC ever since I've been here, and I'm sure many years before that as well. You'll hear from us annually asking about your water and wastewater rates, but do periodically conduct these more extensive surveys as well, and really do appreciate all the work and all the expertise that they bring to the table on these issues. Utility issues and the management and the planning related to that is something that we spend a lot of time on at the League. Both working with our municipal members, working with members of the legislature who have questions about this, and frequently call on the Environmental Finance Center to work with us and work with our partners on these issues. So I won't say a whole lot more about that at this time, but again, thank you all for joining us. Thank you to Carol and Shadi and everyone here, and I will turn it back over to Carol to move us forward this morning.
Thanks so much, Chris, and we really appreciate partnering with the League as well. So thanks for joining us. So before we fully get everything underway, I want to take a quick poll of our audience to see who we have in attendance. So you should see the poll up on your screen right now. It says, what type of organization do you work for? And your options are local government, including special districts, non-governmental water utility, such as an association or another type of water utility, state government, technical assistance provider or consultant, and other if you feel that any of these other options do not fit you. So please go ahead and participate in the poll. It looks like about 75% of the audience has voted. So we'll give you another couple seconds there. Okay, and we're going to close the poll. Thank you for participating. And so you can see the results here. So about 41% of our audience today, or 41% of our audience today, is represents local government. Next, we're joined by 27% of our audience being state government, and then we have some technical assistance providers and non-governmental water utilities, as well as some folks in the other category. So thank you very much for being here with us. So I'm going to start by giving a brief overview of the survey that we did about utility management. Our objective in conducting this survey and the long-run goal is to enhance North Carolina water and wastewater utilities' resiliency to changes that can impair their financial resources and ability to effectively provide services by evaluating long-term planning practices at utilities and sharing best practices. So that was our objective, and our hypothesis in conducting this survey is that utilities that undertake more or earlier long-term planning efforts benefit from more resilient finances and improved system performance relative to other utilities. And so what we're presenting here today is a summary of what we've found in the survey, just the sort of basic descriptive statistics, and we will be following up with a further report looking at a regression analysis that really looks at the correlation between long-term planning efforts and resilient finances and improved system performance. So please be on the lookout for that. The way the survey worked was we created the questions using guidance from the American Water Works Association, AWWA, and other sources, and we identified 5 key types of planning. We would have liked to ask about many more types of planning, but there's only so much space and so much time and attention we can expect from people. And we distilled those types of planning down into component efforts. So, and this was done so that if a utility doesn't necessarily have a binder that has a title that says capital plan, but they maybe undertake some type of capital planning, we wanted to make sure that we captured that effort. So we started by asking what we considered to be a key question about that indicated whether or not they do any of that type of planning. So actually here, if you can see, it's a little bit small, but under financial planning, our key question was, does your utility set specific financial targets and goals? And if the utility answered yes to this, we considered them to have a financial plan, and we sent them through on the survey to the further questions about financial planning. And again, this really helps us better capture the efforts of smaller utilities who may be less likely to have a fancy stapled copy of an asset management plan or just something along those lines, but may indeed be taking some of those efforts. So here you can see how we defined our various planning efforts, and the 5 types of plans that we chose to focus on were financial plans, asset management plans, capital improvement plans, disaster emergency resiliency plans, and long-range water resources plans. And that's how we defined all of these. And again, in terms of the key questions, I mentioned the one that we had for the financial plans. If we considered a utility to have an asset management plan, if they had a list or inventory of key assets. We considered a utility to have a capital improvement plan if they had a list of, if they identified a list of potential future capital projects, either in an official or unofficial document. We considered them to have a disaster, emergency, or resiliency plan if a utility has documented different types of threats or emergencies that the system might be vulnerable to and has a document addressing at least one type of threat. And finally, if the utility engages in a long-term supply or demand forecasting exercise, we considered them to have a long-range water resources plan. We distributed the survey electronically through the Qualtrics survey software. We distributed it to 511 different utilities across North Carolina. They serve the vast majority of North Carolinians and nearly all of North Carolinians on centralized systems. We asked for input from state and local officials about the questions in the survey, and also had several utilities pre-test the survey to make sure that we were asking questions and offering answer choices that were relevant for them. We also offered incentives for completing the survey or for completing the survey earlier, and we collected data over the period of 3 or more months in order to make sure that we really captured everybody, even if we happened to hit a time that was a little bit busy for them. So you should be able to access a copy of the summary results report through the handouts part of your GoToWebinar control panel, but this is the first page of the report, and it's also available on our website at the URL linked here, and you click on the resources tab. And once we have a recording of this webinar, we will be posting the recording on that same project page, and we will also be posting the slides. So if there's something you want to look back at today, feel free to go there, or if you have colleagues who weren't able to make it, please feel free to send them that way. So on that note, I want to take a quick survey about who has had a chance to look at the results report already. So you should see this poll on your screen about whether you've had a chance to read through the summary of survey results. Your options are no, not yet, I glanced at parts of it, but not in detail. And finally, I'm familiar with most of it by now. And I hope many people select the third option here, but if you feel very strongly about that third option, I'm happy to turn the presentation of this webinar over to you. So we've got the results coming in. We have about 75% of those in attendance, so we're going to close the poll. Thank you very much for participating. And it looks like the majority of people have not had a chance to look at the survey results yet, which is actually great. Glad you're joining us for this webinar, so it'll be new information for you. 35% of you have glanced at it. Hopefully this will be a refresher and go into a little bit more depth. And for those 15% that are familiar with most of it by now, I invite you to please raise your hand to take over control here at any time. So, all right, getting underway to look at the results. Here's the response rate to the survey by type. As I mentioned, we sent the survey to 511 different water and wastewater utilities. We had 227 utilities, which is 44%, participate. We were very happy with that response rate. I should mention this was a behemoth of a survey. It was an 83-question survey. It took 40+ minutes for people to complete. So the fact that we had so many people participate, we really appreciated. For those of you on the webinar today that did participate, thank you so much for taking the time. Again, we really appreciate it. This has been some really fascinating information to collect. So the response rate was highest for municipal utilities, and we certainly had participation from other types of utilities as well. On each of these following questions or results that I present, you'll see that not every question was answered by every respondent. In all cases, the results that we're reporting here are based on the utilities that responded to the question. So the N value that you'll see on many of these slides it indicates the number of utilities that responded to that particular question. This next slide shows the response rate by size of utility, and we really were grateful to have utilities of all sizes participate in the survey. We were concerned that smaller utilities have fewer resources available at their disposal and might participate at much, much lower rates, but you can see here that we had significant participation from smaller utilities, although certainly, as we expected, the response rate was higher for larger utilities. And the primary respondents that we found, about 1/3 of the primary survey respondents were the manager of their utility. You can see in this little wordle here, the larger titles indicate more of the titles of the respondents were that title. So we had a lot of utility manager or finance director respond, but again, the primary survey respondent was often the utility manager. All right, so now we're going to get further into the results of the survey, and I want to mention also that within those 83 questions, we had quite a few that were some questions that we've been collecting data on over the course of a couple iterations of this survey, but I'm going to focus here on the questions that dealt with planning efforts, since that was the major thrust of this project. So if you're interested in other information that we collected, I encourage you to take a look at the written report, because all of that information is available there. On the charts that follow, if you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed by what to look at, or if it's looking too small and you're not feeling like getting out your reading glasses, you feel free to relax your eyes and just focus on the colors. If a bar is in blue, that indicates a strength. It's an optimistic result. There's opportunities to learn and to learn from the utilities that conduct that type of activity, and there's best management practices to uncover there. Results that are in orange are challenges. It's a little bit more of a pessimistic view of the world. There's opportunities to improve and opportunities to provide assistance. So my colleague Shadi was pointing out earlier that in the report and also in this webinar, we take a little bit of a optimistic view of the results. So often you'll hear us say 50% of utilities are undertaking this type of planning, which leaves unsaid that 50% are not undertaking that type of planning. But I want to make sure that we highlight the fact that just because there are in many cases, a majority of utilities who are doing some really great work and doing some of these types of planning that are above and beyond what they are regulatorily required to do. It doesn't change the fact that there are some utilities who are struggling, not due to any fault of their own other than that they face resource issues. And in many cases, these can be many of our smallest systems. So starting with financial planning, which as I mentioned earlier, this was one of our 5 types of planning that we focused on. And our key question here was whether a utility set specific financial targets and goals. And we found that 62% or more than 62% of utilities set specific financial targets and goals. And many of these utilities have those targets and goals approved by their governing body. We also looked at how utilities assess their financial performance, and the majority of utilities monitor their finances against their budget at least monthly, which was actually really gratifying to see. It was good to know that people are paying attention to where they're at. Most are comparing their financial performance to their own long-term trends and against benchmarks. Some are looking at their performance versus peer utilities or state or national benchmarks, but only a few are focusing on credit rating agencies' scoring criteria, which again is not too surprising. That is good to hear and also what we would expect to hear. The second type of planning that we looked at is asset management, and 87% of the utilities that responded to this question are currently developing or have an inventory of their assets. For utilities with asset inventories, location is the most likely information that they're recording, followed by asset age, whether there's an operations and maintenance plan for that asset, and the maintenance history of that asset. Very few, only 2% of utilities, have inventories without any additional information, although less than 30% of utilities include the planned year or prioritization rank for rehabilitating, replacing, or retiring assets. So we see some great work there in terms of tracking assets. There's a little bit of room for work to be done in terms of making sure that, or having a plan in place for making sure those assets are maintained and available to the utility to serve for years to come. The next type of planning that we asked questions about was capital planning. And our key question under capital planning was, has your utility identified a list of potential future capital projects? And I'll get to that in a second, but we felt capital planning was so important that we asked some questions of all utilities whether or not they indicated that they have a capital plan. So here you can see we looked at whether utilities can cover their capital improvements as well as their expenses. And the majority of utilities, 53%, said that they can comfortably cover more than half of their planned capital improvements and unplanned or emergency capital improvements during the year, which again, as I mentioned with our optimistic view here, that means that half of utilities cannot comfortably cover more than half of those capital improvements. So that's something to be a little bit concerned about. However, we also found that 51% of responding utilities have a fund designated for capital reserves, which is a best practice in terms of capital planning to make sure that there's funding available to execute those capital improvements. And in fact, we found that 24% of utilities responded that they can cover all of their capital expenses, which was, again, great to hear. This slide shows what I was referring to earlier about the key question about whether utilities have a list of potential future capital projects. 81% of responding utilities have a list, and most of these are published in official documents such as capital improvement plans. We found that 51% of the capital plans or capital planning lists have a long planning period, which we define to be greater than 10 years. And the majority of capital plans or capital planning lists include detailed information such as cost estimates, which 94% of the lists included, priority rank for projects, which 82% of the lists included, explanation of how projects will be funded, which 69% of the plans included, and a timeline of when projects will start, which 66% of the lists included. So we see that utilities that are undertaking capital planning are doing quite a thorough job of looking at all of the angles, whether it's timelines, priorities, or funding for their projects. The next type of planning that we looked at is disaster, emergency, and resiliency planning. And although those three things are distinct, we combined them for the purposes of the survey, again, with the idea in mind that the survey could not be endless, but certainly there's room to ask further questions about each of those three independently. So our key question for disaster, emergency, and resiliency planning was whether a utility has documented different types of threats or emergencies that their system might be vulnerable to. And we found that 72% of utilities have or are currently developing documentation of at least one type of system vulnerability. And in the chart you see here, you can see what types of vulnerability systems are documenting. And in fact, these were their own utilities' own responses. We did not give them these options. So utilities, the majority of utilities that are, the greatest number of utilities were documenting vulnerabilities related to natural disasters, but we also saw utilities documenting planning around drought and water shortage, which was 48% of utilities, and man-made disasters, which are 29% of utilities. And you can see here that obviously this chart does not add up to 100%. We allowed utilities to say that they were undertaking various different types of planning for different types of vulnerabilities. We also found that nearly half of utilities conduct vulnerability assessments, and more than half assess the consequence or severity of threats, which is a further type of disaster or emergency planning. And finally, we found that utilities are deterring or mitigating threats through redundancy in their system, which was 88% of utilities, response action plans, 82% of utilities, and interconnections with other systems, which was 73% of utilities. So there's a lot of interest and focus on disaster, emergency, and resiliency planning, and some innovative ways to deal with whatever might be arising. I should say also, we later will talk in the webinar, we'll talk a little bit about what we consider to be the quantity of all of these types of planning, meaning how long have utilities been undertaking these various plans. But we also did look a little bit at what we termed to be quality of planning. And by quality of planning, again, the survey is a rough tool for all of this, but we looked at what amount of planning under each of these categories utilities are undertaking, meaning how many of the questions under a given category did they say that they're actually doing that type of effort. And so if they were undertaking more efforts, we considered them to be doing a higher quality of planning, which again is a rough metric because it weights all types of efforts equally, but we wanted to see if quality of planning has any influence on financial stability and resiliency. And although that information isn't included in the summary report in the webinar today, that is part of what we will be including in our further analysis that includes the correlation and regression analysis that I was mentioning earlier. So keep an eye out for that. So the final type of planning that we looked at is long-range water and wastewater resources planning. And approximately half of all utilities engage in long-term supply or demand forecasting. We found that supply and demand forecasts go out 10 to 20 years for 50% of all utilities. And our key question here was just, does your utility engage in long-term supply or demand forecasting? So that's what this chart is demonstrating. However, you should note that all local governments in North Carolina are required to complete local water supply plans. And so it was a little bit of a mystery to us about why the other 49% of utilities either don't know or do not engage or state that they do not engage in water and wastewater resources planning. And it's possible that what they're required to do for the state, they did not consider to be a full-out long-range water and wastewater resource plan. It's possible that the person responding to this survey just wasn't aware that this is something that their utility does, perhaps in a different department. So that's something to keep in mind here. They also told us that their Forecasting considers a variety of factors, including population growth, which 93% of utilities told us they consider, demand, which 73% of utilities told us they consider, and customer or territory or land use characteristics, which 54% of utilities told us that they consider. As I mentioned, we looked at what we call the quantity of planning, and in this case we used years as a proxy for quantity of planning. And I apologize if this chart is a little bit small, but please feel free to look at the report and you can zoom in as much detail as you care to. What it's showing here is the 5 different types of plans. So from the top, financial plans, asset management plans, capital improvement plans, disaster emergency and resiliency plans, and long-range water resources plans, and looking at what year utilities told us they began that type of planning. And so you can actually see that for many types of planning, the bars are larger towards the right-hand side of the chart, meaning they've undertaken that type of planning, they began undertaking that type of planning more recently. But interestingly, in terms of when the majority of utilities began planning, they tended to begin financial, capital improvement, and disaster emergency and resiliency planning 15 to 20 years ago, so a little bit longer, whereas they have begun resiliency, they have begun long-range water resource planning. Let me start that again. They began financial, capital improvement, and disaster emergency and resiliency planning along with long-range water resources planning, let's say in the 2000s, so 15 to 20 years ago, while they were more likely to have begun asset management and capital improvement planning in the 2010s, so let's say 5 to 10 years ago. So, some of that may be driven by regulation. Otherwise, I think asset management and capital improvement planning are perhaps things that smaller utilities are starting to come to in more recent years. So it's good to see that utilities are getting started with that, even if it hasn't been as long of a time horizon. So we also looked at how frequently utilities update their plans, and this kind of goes along with the quantity of planning. How often are they updating their plans once they have them? We're very proud of this chart, which is called a diverging stacked bar chart, in case you're interested. But you can see on the left-hand side of the chart in blue is what utilities that have that responded that they're updating this type of plan continuously or every year. And on the right-hand side of the chart in the warmer colors is utilities that told us they're updating this type of plan every 2 to 3 years, every 4 to 5 years, less frequently than 5 years, on an ad hoc basis, or they haven't updated the plan since its creation. So we were heartened to see that utilities are actually most likely to update plans of all types every single year. And again, if you want to take a closer look at this chart in more detail, take a look at the summary report, but in case it's a little bit hard to see, just the top bar there is financial plans, the next one is asset management plans, then we have capital improvement plans, then disaster emergency and resiliency plans, and then at the bottom, long-range water resources plans. All right, so that is what we're going to be presenting today in terms of planning. I have a few more pieces of information that we included in the survey that I want to cover, but before we do that, we're going to have another poll. So you should see up on your screen a poll now which says, which of the results somewhat surprised you? So we're interested to know, just as you've been listening, is there anything here that sounds a little bit different than what you might have expected? So if none of the results surprised you, maybe this is the 15% of people who have been really reading this report in depth, or maybe you have a crystal ball and you know exactly what's happening with all utilities across North Carolina. If so, we'd like to talk with you. But feel free to select if you were surprised by the financial planning results, the asset management results, the capital planning results, or the resiliency planning or long-range water resources planning results. So the answers are coming in. We'll just give a few more seconds until we have about 70% of participation. We're almost there. If you're asleep at your computer, please participate in our poll. This is your wake-up call. All right, and so we're going to close the poll now. So looking at those results, it looks like a good number of people were surprised by none of these results, 29%, but many people seem to have been a little bit surprised by the resiliency planning or long-range water resources planning results. And that's, as I mentioned, we were surprised too, particularly by the long-range water resources planning results. Interestingly, not too many people surprised by the capital planning results, but a few by the financial planning and the asset management results. All right, well, thank you for participating in the poll, and so we'll return to the presentation. We did ask utilities about how they integrate their plans with other local plans that may be being done by other local government departments or county level departments. And we found that utilities sometimes played a role in the broader non-utility planning efforts of the local governments that they serve. And so we found that only 28% of utilities were likely to be significantly involved in helping to develop a different part of local government's plan. 34% were sometimes consulted, but in some cases they were not informed and were not consulted. Oh, I apologize, that's out of place, but we did ask what surprised you today. Thanks for participating in the poll again. We also asked a whole lot of questions about reviewing utility rates, which I'm going to talk about very, very briefly here, but again, I encourage you to look at the full report if this is a topic that interests you. So of the utilities who reported a need to raise rates, 66% approved a rate increase greater than or equal to the amount recommended in the rates review, which I think actually surprised us a little bit. We were heartened to hear that utilities that found they needed to raise rates were able to do so for the most part. And you can see here that we also gave options for whether the rate increase was not approved or whether a rate increase was approved in less than the amount recommended in the review. For most utilities, we heard that they use internal staff analysis to project future rates. We also heard that 80% of utilities rate reviews showed a need to increase rates. So certainly here at the Environmental Finance Center, we offer a lot of resources about rate setting. And if your utility has found that you need to raise rates, we encourage you to take a look at the resources available on our website. And we're certainly also available to provide technical assistance if you have questions that are specific to you. We also found that the rates last proposed to the governing body for the majority of utilities were sufficient to maintain a strong fiscal condition and meet most current capital needs. And this was interesting because in some cases outside of North Carolina, we have found that folks were not necessarily proposing to their governing body rates that were sufficient to meet their needs. And so the fact that we found that the majority of utilities in North Carolina are, at the very least, asking their governing body for rates that are sufficient was good to know. And finally, we checked in with utilities to see what objectives most influence their rates and their rate structure. And so we found that for 80% of utilities, recovering the cost of operations and maintenance and debt was what influenced their rates and rate structure the most. 71% said maintaining affordability for residential customers was what influenced them the most. And keeping rates comparable to other utilities rates, we found 41% of utilities said that that was their objective that influenced their rates. And so in particular for utilities that are looking to keep their rates comparable to other utilities rates, we encourage you to go onto our website and look at the North Carolina water and wastewater rates dashboard, where you can compare yourself on a variety of different metrics to other utilities throughout the state, in your category, whether you're a local government or a for-profit or an authority, and again, to slice and dice that in a couple different ways to see where you stand versus others. We also asked about current utility revenues, and we found that nearly half of utilities anticipate generating enough revenue for some capital needs, but not necessarily all capital needs. And this relates to some of the questions that I talked about earlier in terms of capital planning. But you can see that 19% of utilities told us that all operations and maintenance and debt service and needed reserves for short-term capital needs were covered by their current revenues. So great for that 19%, but and good to know that the majority of utilities are finding ways to cover some of their capital needs, but definitely there's work to be done and room to improve in terms of being able to cover those capital needs. It is also important to note that all operations and maintenance and all debt service, 26%, in the yellow bar there, 26% of utilities told us that they are able to cover all of their O&M and all of their debt service, which is pretty low, but there's lots of room for them to also be able to cover their capital needs. So they're making it on a day-to-day basis, but they're not necessarily able to be planning for the future. All right, and so we have another poll question here. We're going to get to the Q&A in just a second, but I encourage you to submit questions through the box on your GoToWebinar panel. While you're thinking about your questions, here's a poll to fill out if you'd like to subscribe to the EFC blog. Your options are yes or no, I'm already subscribed. We hope nobody just doesn't want to hear from us. But and if you missed this poll, you're certainly able to sign up for our blog on our website as well. But we have a lot of information that comes through our blog where you can learn more about water finance and management. And we're also going to be posting more of the results of this survey onto our blog. So when you're, if you're saying, I really enjoyed this webinar, but please, I want to know more, sign up for the blog so you get notified for when our regression analysis is available and further details. So we're going to close this poll now. Thank you very much if you chose to sign up. And we're going to move on to the Q&A. Like I said, if you have questions, please enter them into the questions box. And while folks are gathering their thoughts about any questions that they might have, I'm going to ask our color commentator, Chris Nida here from the North Carolina League of Municipalities, to jump back in and let us know if he has anything to add or anything he'd like to comment on.
Thank you, Carol. I don't have a whole lot to add, but I appreciate you running through all those results and all that great information today. It's great for us to have and to know what is actually going on out in the field. You know, I'm encouraged by a lot of the results. Some of that may have been Carol's optimistic framing and their glass half full approach of the Environmental Finance Center. Obviously, there's room for improvement and room for growth in a lot of utilities out there, but a lot of great things are already happening, and so it was good to hear that in the survey. You know, while the questions are coming in, I would just add, you know, I think there's a growing recognition and appreciation among myself and my colleagues at the League of Municipalities of a lot of the challenges and opportunities that come with managing utility systems. You know, we work specifically with municipalities by and large, but I think that rings true for however your organization might be set up, whether you're a nonprofit or a county system or an authority, whatever it might be. Just to talk about what we're doing at the League just a little bit for those of you that may not know. As of January of this year, we brought on 4 new employees that we are calling municipal operations consultants. They're longtime municipal employees. They have a range of experience in as city and town managers, finance officers, working in budget departments, and they are based in the field, working part-time with us, but traveling the state, meeting with our municipal members to work not just on utility issues, but any other kind of financial or operational challenges that you may be facing in your municipality. But one of the issues that they keep running into over and over is smaller governments and smaller utilities that have a lot of challenges in maintaining their system and making sure that their system is set up for the future and plan for the future, and you know, just being aware of the opportunities that are out there and the resources that are available that might help them out. So we are going to continue that work. I mentioned that in part just to let you know that That is a resource that is available to the League. So for those municipal members of the League of Municipalities that are out there, if you're interested in having a visit from one of the consultants and just talking through with them what's going on locally and see if there's anywhere that we can help or connect you with additional resources, please let me know. I don't know that my contact information made it onto a slide anywhere, but you can easily find my email address, but it's cnida@nclm.org. And if you go on the report, my name is on there, and please feel free to give me a call or shoot me an email at any time, because I'm happy to talk more about what the League is doing. We, of course, offer insurance services as well, and if you participate in our workers' compensation or property and casualty pools, I know we do a lot of risk management and loss control work, some of which may be applicable to what you're doing in your utility locally. So please, if you're a member of our insurance pools, please take advantage of that as well. But again, like I said, we do a lot of work on these issues at the League. There is a legislative study committee that is ongoing now that is taking a look at utility issues, but is focusing, I think, in particular on small utilities and their challenges and what kind of strategies might work to make sure those utilities have the support that they need going forward. And Jeff Hughes here at the Environmental Finance Center has worked with that committee extensively. Our government affairs team has worked with it extensively, and we know it's a conversation that is going on around the state and is going to continue going on as well. And so if you have any questions about that or thoughts or want to take advantage of any of our resources, again, I just reiterate, please feel free to reach out to me at any time. If I can't answer your question, I'm happy to try to connect you with somebody who might be able to. And again, I just thank you for your time this morning, your participation in the survey, and for the Environmental Finance Center for all their work and their continued partnership as well. And so unless a question comes in, that may be the last you hear from me. But again, just thank you very much, and I will turn it back over to Carol.
Thanks so much, Chris, and my apologies for that oversight without your email address, but we'll make sure that the version of the slides that we post up on our website has your contact information. And certainly, as you mentioned, it's also listed in the report on our website. So again, if you have any questions, now is your time to submit them. I just want to mention briefly that we're having a webinar that's a follow-on to this one called Setting Financial Targets for Water Utilities Beyond the Budget. And the idea here is that what we heard from utilities is that many of them are setting financial targets, but not all. And we wanted to present an opportunity for further learning about best practices around financial planning. So it's going to be an overview of setting financial targets and measuring utility performance against those metrics. We're going to have a peer-led learning experience. So we're going to have utility speakers with outstanding financial performance present and share how they measure their performance and what they do in terms of financial planning. The date of that webinar is going to be in mid-September, and you can stay tuned for details at the URL listed on screen, but also we'll be sure to send an announcement out about that webinar to all the folks who registered for today's webinar. We'd also like to relatedly have another poll here to ask about what topics would you like to learn more about. As I mentioned, here at the Environmental Finance Center, in addition to applied research and technical assistance, we spend a lot of our time doing training, and we want to make sure that that's as useful for everyone as possible. So your options here in terms of topics you'd like to learn more about are financial planning, asset management, capital planning, emergency or resiliency planning, and long-range water resources planning. Certainly, we're happy to provide information on other topics, and you can email us with suggestions, but these are your options for today. So please go ahead and select what interests you most and what you'd like to hear more about. And it looks like we've had a majority of people participate in the poll, so we're going to close it right now. It looks like a lot of people, 63%, would like to hear more about asset management. If you're interested in asset management, I also encourage you to look at the Environmental Finance Center Network's website. We have, through the network of centers across the country, we have some really amazing experts on asset management, and on the EFCN Network website, there are resources as well as presentations and recorded webinars focused on asset management if you want to get started learning about that, but that's great to know, and we will keep that in mind in terms of topics for future trainings. And it looks like about 56% of you would also like to learn more about financial planning. So great news, we have a webinar coming up in September that you can tune into. So stay tuned for more information about the details of that webinar. All right, and it looks like we do have a question that's come in, so I'm going to turn it over to Shadi Eskaf to field the question.
Thank you very much, Carol, and thank you, Chris, also for joining us, and for everybody who's listening in and submitting questions. Actually, we have a couple of questions, and one is actually, I'm going to go with the ones most closely related to what you were just talking about. Asset management seems to be on people's minds, and one question is, we show kind of asset management in terms of just the most basic thing. You have to have an inventory of assets, and that's the start of an asset management plan. But asset management is asset management planning is a big topic. There are a lot of workshops and webinars. Actually, if people are not aware, in North Carolina, the UNC-Chapel's Utility Management Committee had put on a workshop focused on asset management a few months ago in Greensboro. And I think all those resources, all those PowerPoint slides are available online somewhere. Feel free to contact me directly, and I'll be happy to connect you to those resources. There's a lot of information in there about asset management. But the question for you, Carol, is besides an inventory of assets, first of all, what other things go into asset management plans? What did we ask about? I think you might have mentioned that kind of briefly. And also, secondly, more specifically about the condition assessment and the criticality assessment. Those are two of the key items of asset management plans to be able to complete a full asset management plan, I guess. You need to be able to assess the condition and the criticality of the assets. So curious to know how many utilities are doing that right now in North Carolina, if there's, if there's some lessons from that.
Yeah, thanks, Shadi. That's a great question. And so interestingly, the thing about asset management is just getting started with asset management ties into a lot of other different types of planning. So let's say you're looking to reduce your energy use, or you're looking to conduct a water loss assessment. Those are go hand in hand with asset management. And if you're looking at doing any of those three things, you should consider doing the other two, because it is a little bit easier to do them all at once. So if you're going to go out and visit all of your different pipes and pumps, you might as well be recording what's the age of the equipment, what's its location, what's its condition, at the same time that you're looking at, is this an efficient piece of equipment, and is it leaking, or are we having some leakage that we can't identify? So as Shadi mentioned, there are a lot of different pieces that we encourage people to record in asset management plans beyond just a list of assets, although that is the very basic start to it. You might want to think about looking at things like, as I mentioned, the location and the age of the equipment, the maintenance history of the equipment, and having an operations and maintenance plan. So, okay, when did we last maintain this piece of equipment, and therefore when are we going to come back and look at it again? And related to that, estimating its remaining useful life is helpful, so that instead of, there are some equipment, of course, that you might want to choose to wait until it fails, but you want to do that with intentionality. As opposed to just, oh, this thing failed and let's run around putting out the fire. It might be better to say, okay, that's a piece of equipment that we said we'd run until failure, versus here's this other piece of equipment that is very critical to our operations and we don't want to run it until failure. And so that's the other piece that Shadi mentioned, is criticality. So you can think of a sort of quadrant where you might place each of your assets, and so based on how critical is your asset and how likely is it to fail, and so you'll end up with some assets in a lower quadrant that are not critical and are not likely to fail, and you can worry a little bit less about those assets. However, the assets that end up in the top quadrant that are critical and are very likely to fail, those are the ones where you want to focus your attention, assuming, if you have unlimited time, by all means focus on all of your assets, but if you have limited time, those critical assets that are prone to failure based on their history or based on their age are where you really want to focus things.
All right, thank you. And then specifically, how many utilities are doing condition and criticality assessments?
Yeah, so we found that 42% of utilities told us that they're doing condition assessments, and 35% of utilities told us they're doing criticality assessments. So again, it's great that we found a lot of utilities are keeping a list of their assets and having an inventory, but the kind of next big step is really to think about condition and criticality in order to make sure that those utilities are focusing their efforts where it's needed most.
All right, thank you. And we have a question from the audience asking about what are the differences between, or is it possible to separate out the differences between, or the responses to some of these questions for small systems versus large systems? I guess the theory or the hypothesis that larger utilities might be doing more of these kind of different components of planning versus smaller systems. So have we done this? Are we going to do this?
Yeah, so it is completely possible to separate out these results by larger systems, which usually we define as greater than 10,000 connections. And we have taken a look at that. I believe, I don't have the results for that analysis in front of me, but I believe that for the most part we found that it was not significantly correlated between size of utility.
I think the correlation was when we were separating out the resiliency, we were looking at the resiliency question of it, and which utilities were more resilient and controlling for different kind of planning. There's a lack of correlation between all three things happening there. But as far as just the pure survey results and components, we have not yet completed our separation. We do plan on doing that, and that will be part of the forthcoming results that Carol has mentioned. So if you're subscribed to the blog, you'll find we'll eventually mention something on our blog about the differences between small and large systems when it comes to planning efforts, but we haven't really completed that piece yet. So next on the agenda.
Yeah, and I'd say if there's a particular piece of this where you're looking at the report thinking, oh, I really want to see these results separated out by size, please get in touch with us and let us know that that interests you specifically. You know, we're trying to look at all the different ways to slice and dice this data, but it's a lot of data. So any way you can let us know that what types of analysis is most useful to you, we'd be very excited to do our best to undertake that analysis.
Okay.
So with that, it looks like, we have one more question.
Question about capital planning, and we might differentiate between capital planning in general versus official capital improvement plans, because CIPs come in different formats, but they all pretty much try to do the same thing. You've got your capital projects and you've got your cost estimates, which I see from the results here that 94% that said they do capital planning includes some kind of estimate of what those capital costs are, which is great because if you have a capital plan, a list of capital projects without the cost estimate, it's going to be really hard to actually do the planning and to set up the finances. But the question is, aside from having a cost estimate, what's one other best practice to include in capital plan? Is another component that utilities should consider adding to the capital plan?
Yeah, and I should say before I answer that question, I mentioned very briefly at the beginning about the research that went into creating the questions in this survey, but the research was not just about what the questions were, but also about what the options were. So if you were looking for a quick, handy guide about what are best practices around any of these types of plans, I encourage you to pay close attention to the questions and then the answers that we offered, because we were using our research to inform those options. So in terms of Shadi's question about what might be worth going more in depth into for capital planning, what we found was that it's really a best practice to make sure that it's listed in a capital plan how projects will be funded and include a timeline of when projects will start. So again, we said that a utility that told us that they have a list of capital planned or capital projects, that we considered them to have a capital plan, but truly to have a quality capital plan, it's very important to think about how you're going to fund those projects. So 69% of the utilities that told us they have a capital plan included how those projects will be funded, which that 69% is so high, indicating partly how important it is to have a capital plan of any worth. You're going to need to talk about how this is actually going to be realized. And 66% of utilities who told us they have capital plans include a timeline of when the projects will start, which again indicates the importance of having that aspect of a capital plan, because without a timeline, it's just a wish list. So.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'll just add to that too that if you have a capital plan that has cost estimates but not a plan for how to actually pay for those, then again it becomes very difficult down the line to be able to secure the funds that you need. So when we say have a plan for how the project will be funded, it means specifically saying this is a $5 million project that's going to happen 2 years from now. We're going to be funding it through, portion of it's going to be from reserves, or that we have to raise rates in order to be able to pay for that ahead of time, or that we'll be looking for, we're going to be applying for SRF funds or for revenue bonds or some other source of funding, but some kind of an idea of how to pay for the capital projects coming up. Typically, those things are done for the next, projects that are identified for the next 5 years or 5 to 10 years. It's hard to really plan, for projects that are 20 years down the line, how you're actually going to be paying for that. So we'll be happy to answer any questions about that. It seemed like from the last poll that we asked, asset management was high on the list of things that people wanted to follow up on. And again, we have those other resources and other workshops that focus on asset management. We can point you to those. But also capital planning seemed to be high, and specifically the financial planning one. So we do encourage you to sign up when we have the next one scheduled for September. There's maybe time for one more question if anybody wants to type anything in, but I think those are the questions that I've seen so far.
Okay, great. And while we're seeing if there's any last questions, I'll just say thank you to everybody who's joined us for this webinar today, and a big thank you to anybody who's on the line who filled out the survey. Again, that's really what enabled us to do this analysis. And we will, as I mentioned, be following up with further information. First, the recording of this webinar and the slides will be available on our website, and we'll send a link out to all registrants with that information. We'll also be sending out the further details about the next webinar on financial planning and setting financial targets. And finally, look to our blog for short snippets of analysis if you want to keep abreast of what's happening here at the Environmental Finance Center and in North Carolina more generally with water and wastewater utilities. So with that, it looks like no other questions have come in. So thank you again, and have a great day. We'll give you back a few minutes of your day here. Take care.